So this session will kick off with an opening case study to help frame our minds from ADRIAN, and then Greg and Jesse will help kick off the discussion from that case study. But the fundamental goal of this session is about that initial set of questions. Are these the right questions to be asking of the data, and how would we answer with enough confidence? So I'll go ahead and turn things over to ADRIAN for the opening case example.
Okay. So I have to say that it's great to be with the Shark Tank pioneers here. We'll see where we get to at the end of the session and seeing if we have real sharks out there. So let me see if you... So we had actually a number of different use cases that we could consider here. So there are actually a lot of different areas in terms of where there are advances in medical products, expanding indications, and also lessons learned through the life cycle of development. So from diabetes to other areas, what we decided is to actually focus on the use case of novel, or now what's called direct oral anticoagulants, in comparison to warfarin. And to help set the stage is really to understand that this is something that has been a desired therapy for many years in terms of trying to replace warfarin or have better benefits compared to warfarin. And right now what's happened is actually this field has really blossomed. There are a number of indications, so over 7 indications for direct oral anticoagulants, from reducing the risk of stroke and embolism in patients with atrial fibrillation, to the treatment of DVT and pulmonary embolism, to the reduction in risk of DVT and PE, as well as in across different conditions such as surgical conditions, as well as those who are medically ill. And if you think about that context, the early studies, there was really a lot that was unknown about these medical products. But as the life cycle has gone forward, the evidence and the precision around both the benefits and risks gets better and better. And the question comes up is, do you have to have the same type of trial or same type of evidence generation for each stage? And if you consider just atrial fibrillation itself, it's a common and increasing condition. It's the major focus for stroke risk reduction. It's been well known that anticoagulants do reduce the risk of stroke, but we also know that patients do not receive effective or optimal management for that for a lot of different reasons. And certainly the treatments are relevant issues for patients, families, and care providers, as well as health systems, combined in terms of thinking about what's the overall goal in terms of a better and longer life without major events. Historically, we've had challenges with warfarin use. People have to get monitoring for it. When we actually look at the use of warfarin across different risk groups, it's suboptimal. It's suboptimal compared to what we would want to have, and that's even in consideration of those who are at the highest risk. And so this area had an incredible set of investments and development for developing anticoagulants. And we'll highlight that there were 4 pivotal trials ultimately led to approval for novel or direct anticoagulants for the treatment of atrial fibrillation risk reduction for stroke. And this involved over 70,000 patients in these studies. When you look at the different studies, they were quite large. They took a long time, but they also had some differences between the studies. And one example is the RELY study, which used a probe method for assessing outcomes. So actually in that study, people were open label but the endpoint evaluation was blinded. Whereas all the other studies had a double-blind randomized study, And then when you're doing a study that's in comparison to warfarin, it becomes quite challenging in terms of how do you actually ensure that you maintain the blind as well as make sure that people are appropriately anticoagulated in the warfarin arm. The characteristics also differed across the different studies in terms of the risk profile. And so some had a more varied risk profile when you consider the CHADS-2 score, whereas some really emphasized higher risk patients to get a better assessment or of events in that population or higher event rates, such as the ROCKET trial. And one of the key things that were followed at the end of the trial to assess quality in some ways was actually time and therapeutic range. So in the warfarin arm, how often were people in the therapeutic range for their treatment, and could that be a surrogate for quality of the trial? Or is that really a surrogate of the population that's being enrolled? And you can see here across the different trials, there was a variation around the time to therapeutic range, but that also is likely reflective of the patient population and the difficulties that people have with warfarin management. The outcomes were largely consistent. So this is a meta-analysis that showed that relative to warfarin, NOACs had overall a better profile regarding stroke and embolic events. They also had similar outcomes regarding secondary efficacy outcomes, and overall showed non-inferiority to warfarin. And then also importantly, there was evaluation of major safety outcomes such as intracranial hemorrhage, and again showing favorable benefits for NOACs here. So just to highlight some of the difficulties in doing a study like this, if you think about randomizing over 14,000 patients to two treatment arms in a double-blind, double-dummy fashion, you can imagine all the things that have to be done regarding monitoring and adhering to standard of care. So having monthly monitoring across the globe for this can be quite a challenge. And then also making sure that, that all the outcomes are complete and well adjudicated. And then in this context where we have a therapy that is already known for the comparator that does vary significantly regarding the therapeutic window, and we already routinely do heavy monitoring in clinical practice. Now, this in the ROCKET study, one of the things that was drew a lot of attention as the results reported out was the time and therapeutic range for the population. You can see there was a variation despite all the great methods for doing this and attention to it across the different INR ranges. And one of the bigger drivers for this was really things that may be unrelated to the trial design, but relate to the population as well as location and how easy it is to incorporate trials into practice. And at the end of the day, you start thinking about benchmarking. What's all the effort that takes place for this? And so this is just an example of two types of trials, different indications, but you can see that in a more traditional trial where it's really early in the life cycle, you wind up having to collect a ton of data, and then that translates in a ton of costs. Whereas another study that's later in the life cycle, but still aiming to have an indication, you can be more streamlined in the protocol as well as the data collection, and that translates into lower cost. After a trial is done, there's still often questions that come up in its review, its discussions, its applications. And one example of that was with dabigatran, where a meta-analysis stirred up a lot of interest in terms of whether there was a signal for acute coronary syndrome. A group did a meta-analysis of a number of studies, notably They're relatively small in terms of event rates, with the exception of the RELY study, but the summary suggested a potential increase in the risk for acute coronary syndrome with an odds ratio of 1.3 and a lower bound of confidence of 1.03. And so the question is whether this is something that's a real risk or something that was a play of chance. Sentinel, through its data partners and other collaborators, took on the challenge of understanding this area and looked at outcomes of dabigatran versus warfarin in patients with AFib in contemporary practice to look globally in terms of the results regarding the important outcomes of stroke, hemorrhage, as well as other major bleeding, and then also looked at MI. And so if you look at here, there's nearly 50,000 patients that were evaluated in the real-world setting, and the number of events were still small, but did suggest a potential difference regarding the risk of MI. However, when they went on to look at different levels of exposure and also other sensitivity analysis, they noted that the results did vary based on that. And so really noting that the strength and significance of the association between dabigatran and use in MI did vary, and so was not as concrete about that compared to some of the other outcomes, essentially showing similar results to the other prior clinical trials for stroke and intracranial hemorrhage. So with that as a use case, you can see major area, a lot of development across different indications, huge clinical trials to support the evidence generation, but then also questions have come up through the life cycle, and then also the application of real-world data to address some of the questions and seeing what's possible. So I'll turn it over to Greg to lead the discussion.